تلك آيات كتاب مبين لعلك باخع نفسك ألا يكونوا مؤمنين.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and we're gonna start in a minute, inshallah, just giving the chance for the other viewers to join us. So stay tuned. Alright, so Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We're going to be starting right now, and we're going to be discussing the story of fiqh. Last time, in the evolution of Muslim thinking, we talked a lot about the main references that scholars would go back to or use in order to decide something as halal, haram, or the different rulings that relate to Islam. There were a number of issues that we had covered last time. So today we're going to be continuing. Well, how did fiqh start? And of course, some of the most important questions that we'll also be answering is, well, what makes that madhab, and what is the story of those madhab? So when we say the story of fiqh, we don't necessarily mean the fiqh and the foundation of fiqh, because we would all agree that fiqh in itself is actually meaning the main understanding, the main understanding of Islam, main understanding of Islam, and by going back to the Quran and Sunnah. But when we say the story of fiqh begins, there are a number of different things in what we mean by that is basically the story of the madhab. And when we say that, we're actually talking about in comparison with the different eras. So we did talk about the era in the establishment of fiqh, meaning the foundation that was being laid out during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, which is during the time of the Prophet ﷺ till 11th year Hijrah. Then we also talked about how things were gradually changing until the time or the era of things being compiled and the building up period. And we talked about the Umayyad time, the Umayyad period, or actually before that Khulafa al-Rashidin, then the Umayyad period, then later the Abbasi, and how things were slowly being collected, and how later that was going to be the foundation of fiqh. So to continue, we did talk about some sides to the canonization, so certain things in fiqh that were being canonized, and of course we're talking about the era after. So when we look at 132 year Hijrah, that is pretty much right after the Umayyad Khilafah, and to be more specific, it would be the Abbasid Khilafah. The Abbasid Khilafah, at least in the beginning. Now, it is really important to mention that during the Umayyad Khilafah, it doesn't mean that there was no fiqh. In fact, during the Umayyad Khilafah, that's when Abu Hanifa was actually born. Abu Hanifa was born 80 year Hijrah, which you want to put it in perspective, is the Umayyad period is at ends at 132 year Hijrah, and it actually started 41. So the Umayyad period started 41 Hijrah. Abu Hanifa was born 80 year Hijrah. So you're looking at pretty much in the more towards the end, middle age, or the middle time of Umayyad Khilafah time. Yet after the ending, after the Umayyad Khilafah had ended, and during the Abbasid Khilafah, fiqh started taking an independent shape. Well, things are becoming more independent. The scholars were now being put into specialty. So you had scholars of fiqh, you had scholars of hadith, you had scholars of tafsir, you had different specialties that were pretty much helping the specialty grow, and every single school started forming its own madhab. It's really important to say that the word madhab comes from the root dhahaba, which means that it is what a group of scholars might have regarded as the pattern, or a certain route on Islam. And those different madhabs later became their schools, and those were tracing back all the way to the Sahaba. So the different madhab, the different schools in Islam, they actually go back to Sahaba. So it's not that somebody just had an idea and that's how a madhab or an idea formed, but they actually learned from the Sahaba, and the Sahaba learned from the Prophet ﷺ. Later during the Abbasid era, the fiqh studying, which is the fiqh studying, or the Islamic law studying, became organized in where it was then becoming divided into two different fields. The field that is specialized in classifying and studying the fundamentals of Islamic law, which is called al-usul, and the other specialty which studies the details of Islamic law. When we talk about the details, we're actually speaking about deriving the detailed rulings, which is called al-furu'. So look at this, al-furu' and al-usul. What's the difference between both? So al-usul would study the references and how to make use of those references. Let's give an example. So a scholar of usul will say, well, in order to say that the ruling is anything, you would have to go back to Quran or Sunnah. So they would look at the words in the Quran and Sunnah, and they would look at the words in Quran and say, well, if something is giving an order means to obligate. Therefore, if something is giving an order, it's an obligation, and therefore if you're not practicing or putting that obligation into practice, that would mean you're at sin. So this would be a fundamentalist. So what we mean, we don't mean that in the modern connotation to mean extremist, to mean fundamentalist, those that are, that are portrayed in the media to be Muslims that are fanatic. No, this is not what it means. We're talking about the scholars that are specialized in the fundamentals of Islam. It has nothing to do with the political connotation that is portrayed in the media. But the person that is specialized in furu' or in fiqh would look at what the scholar of usul have laid out in terms of different rules and rules or different evidences to go back to, and how to make use of those evidences. And the scholar of fiqh or the scholar of furu' will look at those evidences and learn how to apply those ideas on ground and make it more practical by looking at the evidences in Quran and Sunnah and say, well, this is the ruling for such and such matter. This is halal because the ayah says such and such. This is haram because the ayah says such and such. This is sunnah, etc., because of such and such evidence. Now, one thing is that both the faqih, the faqih is basically the scholar that is specialized in fiqh or furu', and the scholar that is specialized in usul al-fiqh is called usuli, and the usuli and also the faqih would both depend on the sunnah, which were the books that were collected. Now, it is important to note that the books that we know of today, the books of Sunnah, those were compiled many years after this era. So when we're looking at Abu Hanifa, during the time of Abu Hanifa, the only book that was in its process of getting compiled was really the book Al-Muwatta for Imam Malik. That was on its way to getting compiled, but not yet fully compiled. During the time of Abu Hanifa, yet Abu al-Bukhari was not even born. Al-Bukhari was not even born till 200 and some year Hijrah, versus Abu Hanifa, who actually died 150 year Hijrah. So you're looking at a whole gap between these two major figures that yet did not have each other's resources to make use of, or at least Abu Hanifa did not have al-Bukhari, an available resource at the time, which later made it challenging for the madhab Hanafi, as an example, because those tools or those hadith were not available, so they had to use a different form to figuring out an Islamic maxim, which is what Ahl al-Ra'i would use. They would use a different form to understand those methods, to get to the principles of Islam. Now, scholars from different parts of the world have taken upon themselves to collect the different hadith. Now, the scholars of hadith, that was more of, you can consider it a revolution, really, to work on the sciences of hadith and to work on what is called at-tarajim and the rijal. And in that era, which is around, so we're looking at Nasa'i, we're looking at Tirmidhi, we're looking at Ahmad ibn Hanbal, which is pretty much at the end, mid and middle, second and third century Hijrah. That was considered the era of compiling hadith, where everyone was pretty much considered that if you wanted to say any hadith, you were supposed to say the whole chain of narration. You couldn't just say a hadith without going into the whole chain of narration, and that's when it was considered prestigious, it was considered important, it was considered a duty on a lot of the scholars to work on documenting and collecting these hadith before those that had this knowledge were going to die out, and then generations leaving that some huge amount of information on Islam will eventually be lost throughout those generations that have died out. So that's when those hadith were starting to get into that compilation, and they're compiling all those hadith. The madhab later, so you had a group of scholars were working on fiqh, and other group of scholars were working on hadith, and other group of scholars were working on seerah, etc. But most of the scholars of fiqh were pretty much now working in an organized. This is really important to keep in note, because the scholars of fiqh were now being organized in a way of a school form style, and which is called a madhab. So the schools were spread about based on the students. The students would travel, and there would be a government support. This is really important. There would be a government support to help out the students of fiqh do the job, because they were taking government positions in order to work as judges, in order to work as to work as judges, to work in different fields, to make the practice of that fiqh easier to obtain and easier to keep going, in order to make sure that the Islamic law is actually put on ground and is not only laid out in books. Now, when we look at the scholars learning from one another, that was extremely important, because most of the times people would assume that the scholars of fiqh were pretty much at each other's throats and not necessarily working and learning from one another, which is totally not accurate. The scholars were learning from one another. Now here I'm talking about the founders. I'm talking about the founders of the madhab and not the students. The students were also learning, but in the later generations, things are going to look different. The scholars were learning from another. So you had Shafi'i actually learned from Imam Malik, and I believe we had mentioned the story not last time, but some while back. The Imam Shafi'i learns from Imam Malik. Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he learns from Shafi'i, and of course they would learn and even make use of each other's works. Now, during the Dawla al-Abbasiyya, which is pretty much 350-year Hijrah, when we say 350-year Hijrah till 656, it's really important to look at challenging moments during that era, because actually 656, let's put that one on the spot for a second, because in 656 Hijrah, the Muslims were stormed with the Mongol invasion, which they totally had not expected, really. And during that invasion, the Muslims had totally lost all those rich books that they had worked on for many years. During that era, between the 350 to 656 year Hijrah, the Muslims, or it was actually Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who had ordered that there would be a huge city that was pretty much like a university. It was called Dar al-Hikmah. And for that Bayt al-Hikmah and Dar al-Hikmah, it was translating the books in different languages. It was translating the books from different languages into Arabic, and this huge place in Baghdad was considered a place for education and a place that was getting the knowledge from the East and the West and whatever their hands can get a hold on, whatever their hands can get their hands on, and they were translating it. Now, it is really important that during that era, it wasn't just fiqh, but it was other sciences as well. The madhab at the time were becoming even more organized into what really is the basis, the foundation for that particular school, and later, not only the foundation, but later how to apply new rulings based on that foundation. Now, this is really important. So we've got the usul, and we also have the furu' that are a reflection of the main foundation of that school. So the major madhab right now, we're slowly finding a different route. And of course, there were other madhab that started vanishing. Keep that in mind, because there were other madhab that did not necessarily have students to maintain them, to spread them, to document them. And documenting was the most important tool in order to preserve a certain madhab. There were other madhab, but unfortunately, most Muslims only know the four madhabs and don't really know that there are many other madhab that had vanished and were only left mentioned in different books of fiqh that we are able to go to and say, well, what did let's say Tabari say, what did Abu Thawr say, or different scholars. We will just we can trace some different opinions, some different madhab, but the reason why they vanished was really because there was no documentation. The students didn't take it upon themselves to document those madhab. Now that developed into only specific schools that had an organized type of documentation. There were students, there was a documentation, there were books, there was a type of a canonization in where there was some government support that was making and taking use of those madhab, and later the madhab had reached their final form of canonization. The ijtihad later, when we're talking about the madhab itself, later, because most of the issues, most of the topics were researched before, and it became more of replicating what the main scholar had said about a particular fatwa. Later, the scholars themselves had felt that closing the door of ijtihad. What is ijtihad? So ijtihad is not for anybody to just do, because ijtihad is for those scholars that have reached the highest level of one, hifz, memorization, in other words, textual memorization, and two, understanding the situations, and also three, understanding and knowing the previous scholars' opinions regarding different matters. And then finally, based on that revision and based on all those different studies in those three sides that I had mentioned, that they were going to be forming a new fiqh opinion, a new Islamic opinion. Well, that was perceived as there's absolutely no way that any of us can get to that level, and eventually led to the closure of the door of ijtihad. It was totally dropped, and that led to lots of chaos. Comparative fiqh was born. What is the comparative fiqh? Comparative fiqh, because there were different schools, so every single school was right now considered as a separate school, that it was easy. They were becoming canonized. They were becoming documented. There were students that were fully supporting that particular opinion, and there were evidences that were documented, etc. Well, there was the new rise of different schools wanting to compare the different evidences in order to look into, well, what is the preponderant ruling. During that era, which is after 656 year Hijrah, of course, the Muslims at the time, after the invasion of the Mongols, many Muslims were feeling that this was going to be, really as a result of the Muslim stagnation, the Muslim backwardness, the Muslim losing their ability to do what they had earlier done when they had conquered or were victorious in many ends, military ends, political ends, educational, political, etc. Now the Muslims were feeling during that era that was the end of our rise. Right now it's a time of stagnation. We can't really build. We're just supposed to be depending on the things that were mentioned and written before. So the more we go farther, we could see that scholars had become less confident in their own abilities and also in understanding the situation. The four schools right now, we're at four schools. Those are the main four schools. The four schools were the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i. I'll get to the Hanbali because we'll get there and I'll explain why. The four madhab. What leads to only studying your own school and not studying other schools? What that leads to is fanaticism. So those schools were becoming very intolerable with each other. They were becoming more of separate sects, if you may. And the scholars' activity became very polarized within that particular madhab. The revivers, they continued to work to bring the dynamics of fiqh back, but the fanaticism within the madhab, basically because of the the Islamic movement trying to teach comparative fiqh, etc., that resulted in an era where each madhab many times and oftenly found that they were supporting their opinion, or this madhab is supporting whatever it takes to prove them right, and that madhab is doing the same, and that led to a lot of division. Yet that doesn't mean that there weren't scholars that were not necessarily polarized or so fanatic about the madhab. There were scholars that went beyond that madhab, or even the center of that madhab, and did actually let the evidence be the center and not the school. There were many scholars like that, such as Ibn al-Arabi al-Maliki, such as al-Qurtubi, also Maliki, the Nawawi. There were many scholars that, although take Nawawi for example, who was a Shafi'i madhab, but still, and in fact is considered one of the most important shaykh in the Shafi'i madhab, but still considered that there is the evidence to go back to in order to regard something as preponderant or not, at least based on his study. Now, during the era of madhab, it's really important to look at these points. And why is it important to look at those dates right here? So this is 80 to 150 year hijrah. This is really important. You could even memorize these as your birthday. This is really important because when you look at these madhab, the four most important madhab, you can actually learn some things by looking at those dates. When you look at Al-Hanafi from 80, was born in 80 year hijrah, died 150. As-Sidam Al-Maliki, born in 93 year hijrah, so 13 years later after Hanafi, dies 179. And remember, put that along with the dates that we had talked about earlier, which is when we look at the dates for the risal and of course the stagnation and all the different things. So if we just look at really quick, 11 year hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ dies. And then 132 year hijrah is when hold on, I'm just hoping. Okay, I'm trying to type it in to help you see it, but it's not really allowing me to do what I wanted to do. Okay, so from 11 year hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ dies. So the death of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, and then death of the Prophet ﷺ. Then death of the Prophet, let's say right here. And then you had 41 year hijrah to 132, that was the Umayyad time. Then you had from 132 till 656, that was considered the Abbasi time. Then you had from 656 till 923, that was Ayyubid / and Mamluki time. And then later on, from that era, from 923 something, that was the time when the Uthmani had defeated the Mamluki, and then later it became the Uthmani era. And then from the Uthmani era until the modern times, which is 1924, that was the end of Uthmani era. So looking at those periods, this just gives you an idea. Of what are we talking about in terms of years and the madhab, etc. I'm going to move further here because you're going to see later down. Let's see, Imam Abu Hanifa. So we said he was born 80 year hijrah, died 150. Let's move on. So his name is Nu'man ibn Thabit. right? He lived in Al-Kufa in Iraq. That's in Iraq, a city in Iraq. But he originally is from Afghanistan, from a Persian family. He started his life as a businessman selling fabric. His main sheikh was Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, who was living in Iraq, and of course studied from a scholar named Alqama ibn Qais al-Nakha'i, who studied from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. I want you to look at this chain of narration here. This is actually a chain of narration. So Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman studied from Alqama ibn Qais. Alqama ibn Qais studied from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So even in fiqh, Abu Hanifa actually had a chain of narration in where he goes back to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, then goes back to the Prophet ﷺ in order to bring about an understanding, and of course the understanding of fiqh or Islamic law in Islam. So not only is hadith having a chain of narration, but you can see that even in fiqh there's actually a chain of narration where, yes, Abu Hanifa did not meet Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, because Abdullah ibn Mas'ud anyways dies in 32-year Hijrah, but you could see that Alqama ibn Qais actually learned from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and then Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman learned from Alqama ibn Qais, who is a tabi'i, and then therefore becomes the main teacher for Abu Hanifa, his name is Nu'man ibn Thabit. Well, the other part is when we talk about his personality and his students and class, there's something that is, quite impressive really about his personality and the students that later affected the way that madhab, Abu Hanifa's madhab is really studied and later even taught to others. He always analyzed text. So Abu Hanifa, it's, his class where the students would be taking notes. They would take a matter that was probably brought to them by the public, by the situations, so many different situations. Those situations would be reviewed, evaluated in order to derive a ruling for them. His classes were based on discussion. Abu Hanifa would discuss, and in fact, there's a very important story. His most important student is Yaqub ibn Ibrahim. I didn't write his full name here, but his name is Yaqub ibn Ibrahim. Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, the name that he's famous for is Abu Yusuf. So Abu Yusuf, Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, his mother would constantly, send him to, fetch her something from the market, etc. But Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, this young boy, was always, trying to sneak his way to go and hear the class or the dars that Abu Hanifa was giving in the masjid, which is al-Masjid al-Kabir until the time of today. He would sneak his way and go. His mom would constantly find him instead of going to get what his mom had ordered him to get. She would find him always sneaking his way to go to Abu Hanifa's class. Abu Hanifa was a very rich scholar. Abu Hanifa, being a rich scholar, actually saw that Yaqub ibn Ibrahim was always sneaking his way, so he hired for his mother a special servant, just so that they would do the job on behalf of Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, and therefore Yaqub ibn Ibrahim would have the time to study and be a consistent student at Abu Hanifa's class. So this is Yaqub ibn Ibrahim and Abu Yusuf. Now, one thing to mention is that the madhab Hanafi, they did use qiyas over many hadiths. But why is that so? There's a misinformation that many would think that madhab Hanafi does not depend on text, and instead they depend on opinion. This is a very common fallacy. This is one of the most important misinformations about madhab Hanafi. It's not that they depended qiyas over text, but it's that at the time they did not necessarily have the text meaning hadith, compiled as it was available for Imam Malik, who was actually living in Medina. Imam Malik was living in Medina, and all the different resources were pretty much available to him because anyways he was living in Medina. Unlike Imam Abu Hanifa, he didn't have those texts available, especially that a place in Iraq was very multicultural, was very multi-religious, multi-religions, different environment where many people were willing to fabricate a hadith just to support their opinion or even support their deviation, which left Abu Hanifa very careful in what a hadith he would choose in order to make sure that he's not depending his madhab on a hadith that are weak or at least or even fabricated a hadith. Abu Hanifa, also had one of the most important students who was considered the most important scholar to document the madhab Hanafi, which is Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. Without Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, al-madhab al-Hanafi would have probably never reached us. Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani later becomes the most important figure to document al-madhab al-Hanafi and document every single opinion in a number of different books. The students spread the madhab in different places. Madhab Abu Hanifa was later going to be the foundation that other madhahib would learn from in order to move that madhab from just a thought that was discussed into knowledge, into documentation, we'll see how later the madhab Hanafi became that canonized and was later considered the constitution for the Uthmani Khilafah. Because it was considered as the constitution, it was later considered that resource that I would say blended with a lot of different cultures, and it became really a Hanafi type of culture in where people may not realize. We're going to get to that later on. Let's see what Abu Hanifa says about his methodology of finding an Islamic ruling. He said, quote, "I take from the book of Allah if I find the ruling, or the sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, if I don't find anything in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the sunnah of Rasulullah or the sunnah of the Prophet, I take from the reports of this companion." So if he doesn't find anything in the hadith, he will take the reports from the Prophet's companions. And he says, I take and leave whomever I want. I do not go to other than their words. If I reach the matter to only taking from Ibrahim, that is Ibn Sirin, Ata, Ibrahim is Ibrahim al-Nakhai, Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab, then I say my ijtihad as they have said theirs. Now, this is Abu Hanifa saying that he goes to these resources. This is not for us to actually think that, oh, if I reach the matter to Sa'id al-Musayyab and Sirin and etc., this is not for the layman and say, well, I can also say my opinion on Islam. Because even Abu Hanifa himself said what there are priorities, there are resources that he would turn to and we as Muslims would turn to in order to derive a ruling from Quran and Sunnah. Ijtihad is not put up above the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If there is a text defining the ruling relating to a specific matter, that would be the resource that we would had to. If the source in the Quran is also either ambiguous, maybe not specific, maybe too vague, maybe not clear, maybe was even abrogated by the Sunnah, then in that situation we cannot say we're going to stick to the Quran and leave aside the Sunnah. Now, as for these personnels that he had mentioned, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, al-Sha'bi, Ibn Sirin, Ata, Sa'id ibn Musayyib, or this is Ata ibn Abi Rabah. These scholars were actually considered as tabi'een. Tabi'een is basically the generation that learned from the Prophet's companions. They learned from the Prophet's companions, and the Prophet's companions learned from the Prophet ﷺ. So this is just 3 generations. Even Abu Hanifa, between him. So why would he say, for example, Ibrahim al-Sha'bi, etc.? Because remember, let's go back to where we looked at right here, is that Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, this is the generation 1, generation 2, generation 3, and that's exactly the same thing when we look at even generations. So Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib had actually learned from a generation before him, and also Abu Hanifa, and also the Sahabi. So Sa'id ibn Musayyib, his own father Musayyib ibn Hazn actually was actually one of the Sahaba. So Sa'id al-Musayyib was not a companion. He actually learned from the companions. In other words, the distance or the personnel or within the chain between Abu Hanifa and the Prophet ﷺ is the same chain or the same distance between Sa'id al-Musayyib, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, Ibn Sirin, between them and the Prophet ﷺ. Now, there are a number of things to mention about the books that documented al-Madhab al-Hanafi. You could see right here that there are specific kinds of books that they would go back to in order to consider this is the ruling within Madhab Hanafi or not. So you could see that, okay, well, what are these arrows? So let's Mukhtasar al-Qadduri, for example. So we will take this book, and this book was, you could see al-Qadduri died in 428 year Hijrah, and you have the Bidayat al-Mubtadi for al-Marghaynani, who explained and did the sharh for this book, and this book did the Sharh al-Hidayah, Sharh al-Bidayah, actually explained this book, and then you would have Fath al-Qadir ibn al-Humam would explain this book, and so forth till it goes all the way here. So right here, Kanz al-Daqa'iq, al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, which is actually a huge volume. Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq is in it's almost in 10 volumes, 10 huge volumes. And when you look at Tanweer al-Absar, when you look at these books that, whether Al-Haskafi ibn Abdin al-Zayla'i, you could see that these books actually go back to explaining this book, but all go back to the most important books that were written by Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani. Remember when we said Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani was the main figure that documented the Madhab Hanafi, Madhab Abu Hanifa? Here we go. So all these books pretty much go back to the books that Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani had actually documented from the Madhab Hanafi. These are Kutab Zahir al-Riwayah. So here we go. This is just an idea on what it looks like. Now, as for the students, you could see the most important figures, the most important students for al-Madhab al-Hanafi. You could see the different eras that they had lived in and how they taught one another. It was one school after another, generation after a generation, till it actually got to the most important Hanafi school. And the Hanafi in the world is basically in India. In India, that's the most important place to teaching al-Madhab al-Hanafi. Today, the Hanafi school is the largest and probably the most influential. When I say influential, because it basically has the largest population, and it was considered the constitution for that was used by that was used by al Khilafah al Uthmaniyya till the time of today. That is why it is considered probably the most influential, because of the fact that it has a lot to do with the modern challenges, because the Madhab Hanafi, historically speaking, faced a lot of different challenges, relating to non-Muslims, relating to fiqh al-mali, the fiqh of transaction, etc. The Madhab Hanafi is actually most famous in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Turkey. Hanafi Madhab, as the other madhab, considered Quran, Sunnah, Qiyas, and ijma', qiyas and ijma' as the resource for fiqh. You could see right here, if you look at this map, I really like this map, although not 100% accurate, but you could see that you have Hanafi madhab is pretty much this green area. I know that the map doesn't really show the other sides, but so pretty much all this green area is actually Hanafi madhab. There's even more to it, because here we go. The Maliki, although you see this stretch, but I would say this is more exaggerated. It's actually not all this area for the Maliki madhab, but still it is considered very, it's accurate to a certain extent. You could see that the Shafi'i madhab, which is this color, I don't know what color that is, gold, beige, I'm not sure what color that is. So this golden color, at least, well, the Jafari is the golden, but at least this color you could see is pretty much the Shafi'i. You got Somalia, parts of Ethiopia, Djibouti, Yemen. You got right here Bilad al-Sham. You got some areas in Iraq. You got some areas of Kurdistan. You could see right there. You've got some areas. So those are Indonesia, Malaysia, very Shafi'i in their madhab. And you could see right here Ja'fari. And it is really important to note that the Ja'fari or / Shia madhab Ithna Ashari was actually introduced later on in history, but they were generally Hanafi madhab. And that Hanafi madhab was later forced, I would say, by power and military to be excluded and become Shafi'i, become Ja'fari from that time. The other madhab, those are other madhab, smaller madhab, but generally speaking, you could see that the Hanbali madhab, pretty much in the area that is considered the Gulf, but it's really important to mention that when we speak about Sunni Shia, I want you to look at this right here. So this is according, I forgot to put the reference, but let's see, the Sunni Islam, you could see that 45%, according to this, the House of Islam resource, that the Hanafi are 45% compared to 45% of the Muslims, all right? And Shafi'i, 28% of the Sunni Muslims, and you had Maliki are 15%. Now, I know that you might think, well, look at the huge area. Remember, you're talking about a huge area here in where the population is really low. So don't look at all this area. Most of this is actually desert. Real desert. It's considered the Sahara al-Arabiya al-Kubra. This is the biggest desert in the world. So this area, don't think that this, it's a lot of people compared to this. No, you would have just Turkey alone is actually outnumbering a huge expansive area here. So just keep that in mind. The Maliki is only 15%. Which is pretty much, Algeria, Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and also Libya. So these are, and of course, the different African countries, Guinea and Mali and all those different countries, they're pretty much also Maliki as well. You got some right here that are actually Zahiri madhab. It's sad that they did not indicate that. You got some Ibadiyya in Oman and parts of Oman, in those areas. Just keep a note on that. Got a number of Zaydi, which is, a Shia sect, which is right now al-Houthiyyin and those that are causing, along with the Salman, Muhammad ibn Salman's military against the Muslims in Yemen. So very sad to say that. Now the Hanbali, you could see 2%, but you want to remember that the Hanbali was not a madhab at one point. That's why even Ibn Hazm did not regard and did not even go at odds with Hanbali, because he did not consider al-Hanbali as a madhab fiqh. He didn't consider it as a fiqh madhab, and more considered Ahmad ibn Hanbal as a muhaddith than anything else. So you could clearly see that Hanbali madhab was more later developed into becoming a madhab. Let's look at that Sunni Shia and Khawarij, or the Shia at least. Let me look at that one. So you could see the Shia, 9.5%, and the rest are pretty much Sunni. This is according to the House of Islam, so I'll just leave it to what they have estimated based on their research, so I'll just leave it at that. But let's go on and talk about the Maliki madhab. Maliki madhab, right now, I would say considered in during our era, is pretty much in the age of revival. The madhab Maliki, the main teacher, of course, Malik ibn Anas. Malik ibn Anas was originally from Yemen, lived in Medina, and in fact did not leave Medina but once for Hajj, and stayed forever in Medina. He was born in 93 year Hijrah and later died 179 year Hijrah. It's really important to look at the names that had taught Malik ibn Anas. Abdurrahman ibn Hurmuz and Muhammad ibn Muslim ibn Shihab az-Zuhri. This was considered one of the most important scholars. And of course Rabi'a ibn Abdurrahman, who's called Rabi'at al-Ra'i, and Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Baqir. Now I want you to look at Rabi'a ibn Abdurrahman, Rabi'at al-Ra'i, and Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Baqir. Those are considered, at least Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Baqir is actually considered one of the most important figures from Ahlul Bayt and also for Shia. All right. He used to teach at the masjid until he became sick with urinary incontinence. The urinary incontinence really resulted that he needed to stay longer at home and would only come to the masjid only during the class and leave. He did not stay long. Pretty much avoided people, avoided all that socialization. His classes were very free of discussion. He would just say the hadith, just say the ruling. There was no discussion whatsoever, unlike Abu Hanifa's class sessions. There was always that discussion, always that dialogue, always the teacher and the students, exchanging ideas, exchanging opinions. His class was, like I said, free of discussion and only had lectures in hadith and fiqh. The sources that he had depended on were Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', which is the scholars' unanimous agreement, and during that era, and considered this is very unique in the madhab Maliki, because he considered that the people of Medina, just the residents there, because their information, as accumulated information, is traced back closely to the era of the Prophet ﷺ. You're talking about only 2 generations, or actually, 2 generations between him and the Prophet ﷺ. So that's why he regarded that just the culture within Medina, or the people living in Medina, he considered that was more of like a unanimous agreement that traces back to the Prophet ﷺ, that such a ruling, or whatever evidence he wanted to use, was a legit resource and a religious source over hadiths narrated by a small group of people. This is really important to mention, because this acts as very unique in the madhab Maliki. This is not found in any other madhab, but the madhab Maliki, you could see that he regarded, well, not only ijma' but considered that ijma' Ahl al-Madina, considered that the unanimous agreement that was agreed upon between the people that were living in Medina was over and was in itself a source of information. And over qiyas. Qiyas, we talked about that before. It was more of an analogy in where there's al-fara', there's al-asl, and there's the main ruling, and then you would have a new situation that actually goes back to that ruling that we already have a text for. So just as drugs going back with their ruling because of the fact that there's a illah, which is intoxication. So because alcohol drinking leads to intoxication, intoxication was the main reason why alcohol was prohibited. Therefore, anything that leads to intoxication is considered taking the same ruling as alcohol, be it marijuana, be it drugs, cocaine, whatever you may call it. It's going to take the same ruling because of the fact that they share a common result or a common consequence, of which is intoxication in this point. The other part that Imam Malik used as a reference is the companions' reports. The companions' reports, well, of course, he used the Medina's reports. Is he not going to use the companions' reports? But the companions' reports that he had used are clearly emphasized and shown even in the book Al-Muwatta. Al-Muwatta, they're actually called Al-Athar. Al-Muwatta is the book that Imam Malik had compiled that contained reports on, 1, the Prophet ﷺ, 2, reports on the Prophet's companions called Al-Athar. Now, the other thing that he used was al-istihsan, sadd al-dhara'i', al-maslaha al-mursal. I think we talked about that earlier. So the other thing is that Maliki madhab in the world, it's famous in North Africa, as we had seen on the map. The main scholars became the scholars that had spread the madhab. You could see, but the most important figure, 2 figures at least, Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim and Asad ibn al-Furat. Now I want you to emphasize on these 2 students, because Asad ibn al-Furat was later going to be the main scholar, and in fact his own daughter was actually a main scholar too. Asad ibn al-Furat was a main scholar that learned from, remember that boy that Abu Hanifa, Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, that Abu Hanifa actually paid paid his mom a servant to do him the job, right? So this is Abu Yusuf. That was Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, Abu Yusuf, famous for his name Abu Yusuf, who later Abu Yusuf became the main judge, Qadi al-Qudah. He was the first person to use the word Qadi al-Qudah. And in fact, you see that the system that you see in court today, the system that you see in court today in Western court, in where the judge is wearing a certain attire, and the attire is more like a very baggy cloak or whatever it is, and they would sit on a specific area. There's somebody to document. There's the evidences, etc. That is exactly how Abu Yusuf designed the court system in Islam, in the early times of Islam. Abu Yusuf, this is the main person. All right, Abu Yusuf, it was the main teacher. Now, what madhab is he? Well, he's one of the main students, along with Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, one of the main students for Abu Hanifa. Now, you could see that Asad ibn al-Furat is the main personnel, one of the main figures to spread madhab Maliki. This is really important to note, because you could see that Asad ibn al-Furat learned directly from Abu Yusuf. All right, so for those that want to imagine that there was some kind of a hidden war between them, is absolutely wrong. You could see Asad al-Furat learned from Abu Hanifa's direct student. Abu Hanifa's direct student, and Asad ibn al-Furat later spreads the madhab Maliki in the most important, notorious place in North Africa, and which, of course, later is considered in Tunisia, which at the time was called Ifriqiya. Tunisia was called Ifriqiya at the time. And Asad ibn al-Furat is the most important figure to spread al-madhab al-Maliki in those areas. Now, as for Shafi'i, it's actually 6 o'clock already. All right, so we'll continue next week. We'll talk about a Shafi'i, inshallah. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know there's a lot to say, but we'll, inshallah, hopefully, continue as much as we can down the road. So how many? Okay, so we are at slide 128, alhamdulillah. We're getting closer to finishing, so soon, inshallah. Any questions before we end today's class? All right, so this is it, and we'll see everybody, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.